Welcome guys to an episode with the Doomed Hell. Today we're going to make another video based off of the original CPU platform 2023 video that we made. The first video, which I uploaded earlier today, as you can see the date, was on the Intel 9th gen platform, and this was really to show off maxed out gaming performance on an older generation. How can you do that at a sub $400 or sub $500 budget, right around the $400 to $500 mark? And we saw that we were able to achieve it running an i7 9700K that was quite expensive on eBay. Now obviously you can find quite a nice deal on those 9700Ks, especially the KFs that a lot of normie gamers don't really know what they are and what you can do with them. But today we're going to have a separate approach, which is going to be on the AMD side. Now, you guys really should watch this video if you have already AMD hardware. A lot of you guys probably have, older brothers or cousins or whatever it may be that have first gen, second gen Ryzen hardware and that have gotten out of the hobby or whatever it may be. And this is a video that is dedicated for you guys, but it's also dedicated for those who believe AMD is a better platform for them, whether it be the overclockability that is totally acceptable with AMD, or the fact that and it's a little easier in some cases, or the fact that there's an actual upgrade path where you could get 12 cores, 16 cores, or you could put in a 5800X3D, which basically gives you, out of the box DDR5 gen performance. So this is the video I have for you guys, and obviously it's not like a lot of these things you can change, and I will get into why and how that can be and what can you do instead. But I would argue that if you stand by these components, you're gonna get a very nice min-max that will really last for a very long time, just like the 9th gen Intel. So I believe that the CPU you guys should be looking for is the Ryzen 7 5700X, and to max out gaming performance, I believe 4.8 gigahertz is really where you should be aiming for. Overclocked Ryzen 5000 performs just as well as 5000 X3D, and just as well as Ryzen 7000. Obviously X3D gives you a little bit more performance, but it's really so negligible that I would not pay $500 for a chip for that. And so a Ryzen 7 5700X, it's very good value for a dollar. Here is a authorized dealer who's selling it for $220. You could probably get them around $150 all the way to obviously $220, and you could potentially even get them binned, although the binning culture with Ryzen is not as popular as with Intel. So that is something to keep in mind. So I believe this is an excellent bargain deal. Obviously it comes with no cooler, but who the fuck cares, because to be honest, no stock cooler will be able to contain the 4.8 gigahertz. Next is the motherboard. So the great thing about AM4 is that you could go with first gen AM4 motherboards, and they will have a lot of old school features, and they'll be very, very cheap. And this is an example that I have. So here I went with an X370 chipset board, which have more PCIe slots than the B350, but otherwise they're basically the same. But with the first gen Ryzen, which is something that is very important when you're going with Ryzen 5000, is the VRMs. It's very important that you get really high-end VRMs for those Ryzen 5000s, because you're going to be pushing them quite a bit hotter than on the Intel side. So with Intel, you're going to be pushing them 1.4 volts. With Ryzen, it's going to go between 1.37 and 1.5. So it's very important that you get a really good VRM, because when you're running, especially when you're running a lot of cores, it's going to really push your VRM heatsink, and I'm going to talk about that in a sec. So I believe this one is quite a good board, and the reason is you're getting 10 SATA 6 gigabits per second, which is incredible. You're getting two USB 3s in the front. You're still getting Wi-Fi and a PS2 cable, and you're also getting Type C in the back, which is pretty cool. It's two M.2s, three PCIe full-fledged with crossfire capability. So those are two full-fledged X16s, and then this one's an X8. And then you also get X1s if you want to use them with the M.2s, which is like old school. And we know that the VRM is quite powerful, especially that it has an 8-pin attached to it. That's pretty commonplace with the AMDs. They like to just run like one single 8-pin instead of running like two or 1.5. So this is a very good board, I believe, and it's $150, which is just an absolute bargain. If you're looking at a board like this for like X570 or B550, it would probably be double the price. The next board that I have also considered to be pretty good value, and this is also an X370 board, and it has the best VRMs in the X370 lineup, or the Ryzen first gen lineup, is the Crosshair 6 Hero. I had a 5, which 5 Formula Z, which I really like, and I am in the lookout for a Crosshair 4. So I really like the Asus ROG series for AMD, and this one has 1.5 8-pins. It has 8 SATA 6 gigabits, which is still excellent. It has an actual USB 3.1, which is very rare for this gen, and it has a 3.0 if you just want that. You still get all the same slots, but you get an extra you get an extra PCIe X1, and you still get Wi-Fi and a PS2, just like the other board, with a Type C. But this one's a little cheaper. So $120, you're losing 2 SATA ports, you're gaining a 3.1. It's a pretty good deal. And I like that. And so X370, B350 is something that I'd really look into. If you want something a little bit more guaranteed to run like higher end chips, I would definitely look into B450 and X470. Those chipsets also have like out of the box drivers for PBO, and these ones don't. So you'll have to run a static overclock with these, and you don't have the option of PBO. Now, with this specific min-max, I believe that it is better to go with a static overclock, and that has to do, especially that you get better static gaming performance over PBO. PBO will be a little glitchy at times. It won't necessarily boost at the gigahertz you might want, the clock rate you might want. So that's one thing, but the other thing is the RAM, and we'll get into that right now. So in this build, with Intel, I was suggesting some really specific type of RAM. With AMD, you're a little bit more, it's a little bit more vague. And in this case, it's actually not as good of a bang for buck to go with really high-end RAM. Because with AMD Ryzen, because of how we have a FSB limiter at 1900 megahertz, this means that when overclocking the CPU, it's really important to make sure that your Infinity Fabric is actually very fast before you can get some RAM. So actually running like maybe a test bench and trying out your CPU and checking like your actual FSB speeds would actually benefit you when you're buying RAM, because then you'll know how fast it is. But really the top end stuff is going to be 1900 megahertz, which means you're not going to be running any higher than 3800 megahertz DDR4. So it's actually not super far off JetX stock. But with that, it also means that you have to run a CAS latency that's pretty low. The lowest that we've seen on AMD that was actually gaining performance was about CAS 15. CAS 14 actually drops some performance because, again, that synchronization with Infinity Fabric. CAS 13 theoretically gets better performance, but again, there's no such thing as like 3800 megahertz CAS 13 unless you're pushing like really high voltages. So that's just out of the gate, not feasible. But here I have a kit 2x 8 gigabytes, 3600, and this is some Hynix, I believe, which is totally acceptable for AMD. There's not really any preference of like bins, so long as you're running 3600 megahertz, and this is I think C18, but very tight, so it'll definitely do like C16 just fine, maybe even at 3800 megahertz if you're lucky. And that's totally doable with Ryzen. It's not DDR5 type performance in terms of the RAM, the memory latency, but it's close enough that you're not going to notice it. This is really close actually to the Intel 9th gen performance. It's just that you're not going to get the bandwidth with the other DDR4 kit, obviously. But this is obviously also $20 cheaper, which is going to be like overall a little cheaper. So I think this build is definitely cheaper than if you went with Intel, and you will get just about the same performance. So if we look at the price that I have right now, it's 220 plus, and let's not look at this one, let's just look at this one. So 120, and here we have 55. Obviously with the shipping, it'll depend, but I believe you could find 55 locally just fine. And this is if this is Canadian. With American, it will be quite a bit cheaper. So here we have sub $400, which is incredible. Like, that's a very good bargain. You're basically getting the same performance as Intel. But now we have to talk about motherboard preference and things like that. So I went with this board because I knew it was a safe bet, and I knew that it would also be really cheap because it's first gen Ryzen, first gen. A lot of people don't understand that you can run any Ryzen on any board, so long as the VRMs handle it. So with this board, it's going to do it just fine. But let's say you're more on a tight budget, you want to run sub $350 or lower, then there's actually a way that you can make sure your VRMs don't pop on you, and that way is to run a motherboard. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I did that. A motherboard heatsink. So here is a voltage regulator module heatsink. This is for a Dell Precision board, and it's just about the same size as your regular B350/B450 motherboard heatsink. So you could fiddle with this, cut off the screws, you don't need them, but run a thermal tape on the bottom, which will stick it for good. And you can play with this, and it'll help you with your thermals. So here it says 125 watts. That's just about the amount that you'll need for your Ryzen 7 here. And yeah, it's a little sketch, but it will cost you basically nothing, like $20. It might even be cheaper if you can find an old server rack and find one of these on the server rack. This is basically like e-recycle, so, or what do you call that, e-garbage? I don't know, I forget what it's called, but this is a good way to do it. And then if you need even more performance, let's say you're running like 12 cores, 16 cores, Ryzen 5000, you're trying to run like 5 gigahertz, let's say, you can also buy one of these tiny 20 millimeter fans, either 5 volts or 12 volts. Make sure that your motherboard supports it. So up here, you're going to find a bunch of CPU headers, fan headers. These are usually for your CPU fans, but you always have like one extra, especially on these nice boards. Here you got 3. That's usually for like if you have like a reservoir, sorry, not a reservoir, radiator. If you have a radiator, this is great. But if you don't have a radiator, you're trying to run like VRMs really high, you can always buy these tiny little fans, and they do a really good job. Like they will actually flow quite well, and you might not even need one of these in some cases. You just jerry rig something onto your board, and it should just work just fine. So that's quite an efficient way of because here you see it's $12. Even this is like $20. This is quite a good way to get that VRM to cooperate when you're putting in a quite high end 8-core or more CPU. So that's a really good way to do it, and I strongly suggest anyone with half a brain to try this out and figure out if this is for you or not. That's pretty much it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. One other thing I wanted to talk about is like cooling with Ryzen. So with Intel, because you're running like past 5 gigahertz for like really that high-end gaming performance, it'd be really worth looking into custom cooling, like I said earlier in the last video. But I think that with Ryzen, it's just like FX processors, where running a mid-range to like $70 cooler would just be totally fine for a Ryzen, even at like 4.8 gigahertz, because yes, it does run hot on voltage, but these CPUs are actually pretty efficient usually. So running an AIO could sometimes be beneficial, but getting a custom loop just for your Ryzen is I believe a slightly less incentivized proposition, because you're not going to be running 5 gigahertz on this CPU. It's not really limited by thermal throttling, whereas with Intel it is actually like thermal throttling. You can push that chip to the moon, and so long as you have the proper cooling, it'll do it. With Ryzen, it's just locked because of architecture inefficiencies, and there's not really anything you can do about it. So getting like a medium-sized cooler is just totally fine, so long as you get the right fins, the right fans, all that kind of jazz is gonna really benefit you over like getting an AIO. I know with like FX CPUs, they used to sell the chips with AIOs, and actually those AIOs were like inefficient because they had a deal. AMD had a deal with Cooler Master back then, and Cooler Master was basically testing out their AIOs with AMD users. So it helped like both companies kind of figure out what they should do with their marketing and like product development. It was more of like a testing and an experiment than it was actually beneficial. Obviously, you could run that AIO for like a couple of years, but they usually like would dry out first. And I think it's the same thing with like modern day AIOs. Basically the same thing. If you run that thing hot, it's not going to benefit you over like an air cooler necessarily. Air coolers are usually way more efficient, and they will run a little hotter, but they will run the same amount of heat throughout the day, versus an AIO will run cooler first, and then in like 10 hours it'll start running hotter. So that's my 2 cents on that. I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a great day.